Hi, this video is about source documents. So, as always, we are using our accounting textbook as a resource, and we are using pages 60 and 61 in the Southwest Accounting 10th edition to teach the concept of source documents in Accounting 1. So, there are 5 source documents that the students should know in order to do well in this course. So the source documents are on pages 60 through 61 in the textbook. I always encourage students to write down the page numbers in their notebook in order to have that as a reference for future studying outside of class. There are 5 source documents that the students should know. So there are checks, which is on page 60, sales invoice, which is on page 60. There is receipts, which is now on page 61. Memorandum, and calculator tape, which is on page 61. So the students need to know these 5 source documents. So they need to be able to list them, as I've done. They also need to be able to identify them by looking at the document. So one of the ways I teach this concept is by having them look at each one of the options in their textbook. You can also print out copies of the different images and have them print them, put them in their notebook, or have them search for them online, print them out, cut them out, and glue them in their notebook in order for them to have them as a reference so they can know what the source document looks like. They also need to be able to read the source document. And all the source documents have abbreviations. So I also teach that concept at this point. So I tell them checks is C, sales invoice is X, receipts are R, memorandum is M, and calculator tape is T. So those are the abbreviations for each. So then we go on and go through each one of the source documents in the textbook. So we start with checks. So I have a student read out loud what a check is from the textbook. So on page 60, you have the definition of a check. A business form ordering a bank to pay cash from a bank account is called a check. So when I have the students read that, I also explain to them that checks are cash. So when we use a check, we are spending cash. So checks are like spending cash. Then I have someone read the next one, sales invoice. So when you look on page 60 in your textbook, there's a definition of a sales invoice. An invoice used as a source document for recording a sale on account is a sale invoice. So sale invoices are used when we have a sale on account. So whenever we have a sales invoice, we're always going to impact sales and accounts receivable. Always. Sales and accounts receivable will always be impacted when we use a sales invoice because it's a sale on account. Then we have a receipt. Receipts, a business form, I'm on page 61, a business form given written acknowledgement for cash received. So receipts are used when the company receives cash. So cash is coming into the company. So cash coming into the company. Memorandum is next. So a memorandum is a form in which a brief message is written to describe a transaction. So a memorandum is what we use when none of the other source documents will work. The description of the transaction is written on the memorandum. So when none of the other fourth source documents will work, then we use a memorandum. And then the last is calculator tape, which is on page 61. A calculator tape is used for a cash sale. So calculator tape is cash sale. Okay. Okay. So we have our 5 source documents. We have checks, abbreviation is a C, and we use them when we are spending cash. So we're paying out cash. So I wrote cash is going out of the company. Then we have a sales invoice. This is for a sale on account. This will always impact sales and accounts receivable. Then we have receipts, abbreviation R. This is when cash is coming into the company. We are receiving cash. And then we have a memorandum. We use this when none of the other source documents will work. And then a calculator tape is what we use for a cash sale. So that is the 5 source documents, when we would use them, and why we would use them. So then we have to teach the kids how to read the source documents. So for a check, what's important is for them to realize that this part of the check we always mail out. So they will never have this in a problem. They always only have the check stub. The check stub is what they must be able to read. So when you look at the check stub, the top portion of the check stub is what the check was actually written for, but the bottom portion of the check stub is the updated balance of the cash account. Okay, so how much money we have left to spend. So NO always represents the source document number. So that's something you want to let them know. So NO on documents equals the source document number. All source documents are numbered, all of them. Okay. And on a check, because we're spending cash, we can spend cash on anything. So we all must always look at the for line to know why we spent this money so we can know how to record the transaction properly. So when we're analyzing transaction, we need to be able to read the source, the purpose of this check. So the other things that your students need to be able to do with source documents is to be able to write the transaction in words based off of the source document. So we're going to demonstrate that. So the first one is a check, and we're going to use the example on page 60 for checks. So they are writing this transaction in words because they need to be able to read it, but then be able to take it back to the transactions that they have seen previously in the blue boxes. And so I often tell them, look at the blue boxes as a reference on how transactions are written. So if I look at this check stub, it says it's document number 1. It was written for $165 on January the 2nd to Eastside Supplies for supplies. So this transaction could be written like this. January the 2nd, wrote check to Eastside Supplies for $165 for supplies. So that is one way this transaction could be written because they could see what source document it was, they could see who we wrote the check to, what the check amount was, and why we wrote the check. We wrote it for supplies. So it's good practice to have them write different transactions in words based off source documents as practice. So we're going to do the next one, sales invoice. So they need to be able to read sales invoices. So we're using an example from the textbook, the sales invoice on page 60. And our company is Delgado Web Services. So they need to know that we work for Delgado. So Delgado sold to Main Street Variety. We sold them website designs for $500. So when we use a sales invoice, it is always a sale on account. We use sale invoices for sales on account. So the date on this is January the 12th. And we would write sold website design on account to Main Street Variety for $500. Okay, so once again, this is a sales invoice. So when we have sales invoices, we know it's a sale on account. So we sold website design on account. So we sold on account. Who do we sell it to? Main Street Variety for how much? $500. Okay. So that is being able to read the sales invoice and turn it into a written transaction. So next we're going to look at the receipts. Receipts are on page 61. So this is a receipt. Students often confuse receipts with checks. But remember, for a check, they only see the stub. Receipts, you're always going to see the whole thing. Okay? So receipts are used when we as a company receive cash. So receipts, this is page 61. Okay. And so this transaction is transaction receipt number 1, and it occurred on January the 2nd. And we received money from Michael Delgado for an investment of $2,000. So we write it January the 2nd, and then received $2,000 cash from Michael Delgado, owner, for an investment. Okay. Received $2,000 cash from Michael Delgado, he's the owner, for an investment. So that is how we would take that receipt and turn it into a written transaction. Next, we're going to do calculator tape. Calculator tape. So a lot of times I have the students look up a 10 key calculator so they can see what the 10 key calculator looks like. And then I'll explain to them that this is the paper that comes out of the 10 key calculator. And we talk about how to read this. So if it's a plus beside the number, that means those are the numbers that we're adding into the calculation. If there's a minus, that means that that's a number we're taking out of the calculation, and the asterisk sign at the bottom is always the total. So the total of this particular one is $1,100. And on a calculator tape, they always write they always write the date, and then they'll write T, because T is for calculator tape, and then the number is always the date, the day of the date. So this is T10 because January 10th was the date of this transaction. So the 10 for the day is the source document number. So 4. So for the calculator tape on page 61, it is for January the 10th, and it is always cash sales. Calculator tape is always cash sales. So it is cash sales of $1,100. And that is how you can write the transaction for a cash sale. And for memorandum, you would always read the transaction that's written on the memorandum in order to record it. So that would be anything that's not one of these. In the book, this particular transaction is bought supplies on account. So that is what that transaction is for, and it's already written in Word, so you don't have to be able to rewrite it like this because it's already written in words. So this is how I teach my students how to read source documents, how to identify source documents. They must know what each source document is used for. Checks are for cash. Sales invoices are for sales on account. Receipts are for cash coming into the company. Memorandum, we use that for any transactions that cannot be used by one of the other 4 source documents. And calculator tape is for a cash sale. And that is all on source documents.